Today we are talking about the philosophy of Chinese politics. Marxism, legalism, Confucianism. These might sound like big words to you when you think about Chinese politics and philosophy, but if you want to understand their influence on Chinese politics today, this is the video for you. Today, I am joined by Professor Daniel Bell. He's the first foreign dean of Shandong University, and in fact, the first foreign dean of any Chinese university. He was previously based in Chifu, the hometown of the famous Chinese philosopher Confucius. As an expert of both Western and Chinese political philosophies, he's the best person to help you understand the different philosophies affecting modern China today. With that, I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Professor Daniel Bell. One of the first questions I had when I was reading your most recent book, The Dean of Shandong, was that you draw a comparison or a contrast between the Western academic environment and the Chinese academic environment. And most people kind of assume that, in China, it's all censorship, there's no academic freedom. But you seem to have a different view or a different take and different lived experience from it.
Well, there is censorship, and there's increased censorship in mainland China. I don't want to deny that. But there are many areas where there's tremendous amount of intellectual engagement and argumentation. So if you work on Confucianism, for example, it's really diverse debates, some of which are very heated. For example, the latest debate now is whether there's an influential article arguing that sex robots are ideal Confucian wives. And as you can imagine, there's a furious reaction from Confucian feminists. So that's just an example of so much, lots of debates that don't touch on the highest level of politics can and do flourish, and they address issues that wouldn't be of great interest to people outside of China, where, for example, the Confucian tradition isn't of great interest to, or to people from Canada, where I'm from. And there's also less of this kind of worrying about politically correct terminology. I mean, maybe it's changing a bit now with the new administration in the US, but many academics felt that they're treading on eggshells when it comes to issues relating to sex or race. But in China, in that sense, there's less of this informal censorship. So you mentioned my book, The Dean of Shandong. So I began that book by listing all that's wrong with China, because you have to express those views in order to get on to what you really want to say. There's a kind of informal censorship mechanism where it's very easy for you to be labeled as a China apologist. So you have to begin by first saying, China has many human rights abuses and these things are wrong, sure, which is, of course, is all true, but only then will people even listen. So even academically, if you want to publish an article in an academic periodical, and you don't use the language of authoritarianism to discuss or to describe the Chinese political system, you would get knocked down. It'd be very hard to get published. Fortunately, publishing in book form is actually still more free than publishing in article form. There's less of this informal censorship and more room for, I'm going to call it original thinking in the Anglophone world. Another key difference is that in China, there's a very strong commitment to serving the community. So the idea that you would especially in an area in humanities or social sciences, that you would just do your own work completely separate from contributing to the good of the community, serving in the ivory tower. There's less of that tradition in China. And partly it has to do with the political system, but I think it has much more deeper roots. We can label it Confucian ideas of the best life involves serving the community, but there's much more of an implicit or explicit assumption that as an academic, you're not just there to publish articles and seek truth regardless of the impact on the community, that your work should be more closely tied with contributing to the good of the community. Yeah, so those are very briefly some differences, but it depends on the field, it depends on the period of time, it depends on which country we're comparing it to, or even on the part of China. In Hong Kong now, Hong Kong in many ways is much closer to the kind of Western system where you're rewarded almost exclusively according to your publishing record in leading academic journals and university publishers, and whether or not you contribute to the community is almost completely irrelevant when it comes to hiring and promotion, which is closer to the kind of Western model. the good side in Hong Kong is that there's much more academic freedom than there is in mainland China. Hong Kong, in a way, is much closer to Singapore, where you can more or less do and say what you want, so long as it's not about the Hong Kong government. I mean, my experience in Singapore, I think things have changed in some ways, but I still think there's some form of censorship, formal, informal, regarding the Singapore government. But other than that, it's really a very, very free academic environment in Singapore. Hong Kong is a bit similar to that.
I think in Singapore in the recent years, there's been an opening up of spaces for even critiques to enter the public fora.
And we agree. So my first job was in Singapore and US in 91, 94. And those days, frankly, were not ideal in terms of academic freedom. But to write this other book that I wrote called The China Model, in China, it was very hard to address in a kind of balanced academic way some of these politically sensitive issues. So I went to Singapore to spend a semester where I could have great libraries in English and Chinese and almost complete academic freedom. So Singapore is much, much, much better than it used to be.
Talking about the China model, one of the key assumptions that you've challenged is that there is a clear comparison, or the way we should compare governments is between a democracy and an autocracy, in which the liberal democracy is clearly the superior alternative. My question to you is, why do you think that's a false dichotomy?
Well, it's just that the labels are so vague. And on the one hand, they're descriptive. Democracy means you select the political leaders by means of free and fair competitive elections, and usually it involves liberal values like rule of law and separation of powers and protection of individual rights. And then it's also normative, saying that that's a better system than the alternatives. And but that's both the democratic label and the authoritarian label includes so many kinds of diverse forms of government that it's just not very useful for classifying the political world. I mean, as mentioned, my first job was in Singapore, and it was labeled in the West as a kind of authoritarian government. The same label was used to describe North Korea, and Saudi Arabia. And so, just completely different, right? And the same goes with China. I mean, to understand the political system, you have to understand, first of all, what are the motivating ideals, and then try to think of to what extent those ideals are realized in practice, and to what extent there's a way of reducing the gap between the ideal and the reality. I had spent all my previous life in Canada and the UK, and I was I'm going to use the word brainwashed by this view that there's only one legitimate political system, and that's one that selects political leaders by means of free and fair competitive elections along with the associated freedoms, and all the others should be labeled authoritarian and are fundamentally illegitimate. And I carried that baggage with me in Singapore. It took a long time to adjust, and maybe I didn't even adjust well in Singapore. It took a long time to knock that kind of dogmatic view out of my system, so to speak. But it's only really when I was in Beijing, where I spent 8 years at Tsinghua University, and then I realized that, well, my colleagues are not talking about, they're talking about how do we train, how do we select and promote leaders with above average ability and virtue? How do we measure ability? How do we measure virtue? What's the relation between ability and virtue? And then I realized that this way of thinking has such a long history, both as an ideal in China as an institution and practice. It's very fascinating to try to make sense of that. So I use the label of political meritocracy. In Chinese, it's 贤能政治, which is more accurate, perhaps. And I wrote this book, The China Model, which tries to make sense of that ideal, shows its advantages and disadvantages, and suggests ways of reducing the gap between the ideal and the reality. So it's a highly imperfect political meritocracy, just like democracy in, for example, the US would be highly imperfect democracy. But we need to have a sense of, first of all, what is the underlying ideal, and then its advantages and disadvantages, and think of ways of reducing the gap between the ideal and the reality. And I wouldn't even have come up with that question had I not spent so many years at a university in Beijing which trains future leaders. Whereas in Singapore, I did spend 3 years there, and I hadn't quite. It was a shock to my political system, but it was really hard to get this dogmatic view that the Singapore political system is fundamentally illegitimate because it doesn't correspond to the sorts of ideals that I had learned as a kid almost without question. now I think Singapore is, also a political meritocracy. Yes, imperfect, but it's probably the closest to the ideal of any political system in the world. I have great, great admiration. And many of the leaders that you interviewed on your podcast, like Kishore Mahbubani, and I have great admiration for. And in fact, even in Singapore when I was there, I worked in an office where I knew Goh King Swee and went out with him. He invited me and my wife, who was working in his institute, for meals, and my then wife, and I admire him so much. But I still didn't change this dogmatic view that, well, okay, here's a very brilliant and inspiring political founding father, but it even that didn't knock this kind of dogmatic view out of my system that there's only one legitimate form of government and it's not the one in Singapore.
I didn't know that. So it's interesting to hear your roots and experience in Singapore. So then going back to the question of political meritocracy, what would then be the ideal version in your mind as to how it should manifest itself in government?
So scale matters for politics, right? And that's why it's much more important to have some sort of democratic mechanisms in smaller political communities. This is an old point made in political philosophy by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others. There's one example from Singapore which really, to me, brought this to my mind. I admire Giorgio very much, and I was a bit disappointed that he lost his post in an election. And shortly after that, I was in a taxi in Singapore, and then I was speaking to the taxi driver, and I said, "So this really, what happened? Giorgio, he's so outstanding." And then the taxi driver says, "I agree. He's outstanding." And he said, "But I didn't vote for him." I said, "What? Why?" And he says, "Because he didn't come to my father's funeral." And I thought, oh my God. And I realized only in a very small political community would this be an issue, right? In China, it would be, President Xi couldn't go to everybody's funeral, right? So it's much more important in a small political community to have direct relation with one's constituents and to have much stronger democratic mechanisms in a large political community like China. This was an example that brought it home. But China is a huge country, right? So at different levels of government, there's different ways of selecting and promoting leaders. And this is not my own idea. It's through interviews with leaders, including the leader of the Department of Organizations, Wu Zhibu, which selects and promotes leaders in the Chinese political system. And I asked them, which abilities matter when it comes to the selection process, which virtues matter. And then I was told, well, it depends on level of government. At lower to mid levels, then it's more important to use what we would call today democratic mechanisms. See to what extent the leaders have support of the people, to what extent they serve their local community, and among others. Whereas at mid to higher levels, then the issues of government become much more complex, and it's much more important for leaders not just to be able to implement policies, but to think of how to arrive at informed policies that affect huge amounts of stakeholders, not just the local community, but the local country, as well as future generations and people outside the country. And that requires knowledge of economics and international relations and philosophy and history. And for example, if you work on environmental science, and it also requires a track record of making good political judgments. So as you go up the chain of political command, so to speak, it's much more important to have more meritocratic ways of selecting and promoting political leaders. So the underlying system in China is to have kind of democratic systems of selecting leaders at lower levels of government, and then as you go up at higher levels of government, it progressively becomes more meritocratic. That's the ideal. But in between, what do you do? Well, then there's room for experimentation. And part of China's success, to the extent there has been success, is that there's been lots of innovation and experimentation at mid-levels of government when it comes to how to select and promote leaders. So then the question, okay, so more or less we have, so what exactly does it mean to have more meritocratic systems of selecting leaders? Well, so for one thing, it's important for leaders to have above average analytical ability, again, because the issues are so complex and it requires knowledge of many different disciplines and a very good analytical mind. And you can say many bad things about the Chinese political system, but one thing for sure, and I think Singapore here is very similar, the leaders typically are quite brilliant. I mean, at higher levels of government, no doubt about that. But it also, again, politics is not like an academic. If you're an academic, and you just stay in your office and read books or carry out experiments that don't deal with other people, you can still be successful. But in politics, you spend much of your time dealing with stakeholders, and it requires good people skills or EQ, and it's very hard to get through the system if you lack those. So again, it's very important at higher levels of government to show that you have those skills. And most important of all is to have a certain degree of virtue, meaning a willingness to serve the community as opposed to misusing public resources for your own, your family interest. In other words, don't be corrupt. And the question is, how do we assess those skills? Well, again, that's where the Department of Organization is this. It's like the world's largest human resources department. That's the kind of work they do. And yes, it's highly imperfect, and it's constant experimentation. But that's a system that's in place. And if we want to understand the Chinese political system, we have to understand that.
When you talk about the ideal of political meritocracy, actually, and you think about it in practice, maybe it might be fair to say that, and this is drawing from the work of like economists like Yuan Ang, right, where she talks about the fact that China's been actually meritocratic for the most part. If you think about someone like Bo Xilai, he did help propel Chongqing to like a much more prosperous state. But the problem that they face is the issue of endemic corruption.
So when I began to serve as dean at Shandong University, which is the premier university in Shandong province, a province of 100 million people, and it was right pretty much at the height of the anti-corruption campaign. So we had to have small offices, not just me, but the party secretary whose office was next to me, literally quite small offices. So we literally had to like dismantle offices and separate them into two. All the meals we had to literally record every dish that we ordered, and no alcohol at public expense. And so there were all these measures in place that made it quite complicated to spend money, for example, which made people, including me, more conservative and less like innovative and experimental than we would otherwise have been. So this is not a very original point, but certainly drawing on my own experience, I can support the point that excessive, let's just say, legalist means of dealing with corruption and making people worrying about making the wrong steps and being punished for it tends to make public officials very risk averse and conservative in a bad way, meaning that unwilling to consider new challenges and new ways of dealing with those challenges, which isn't very good, frankly, for the long-term future of the country. So the most obvious downside of a corruption campaign, especially one that involves harsh means and makes people fearful of being punished, is that it makes bureaucrats and public officials keep their heads down and not being as experimental and innovative as they would otherwise been. And also, like, frankly, a lot of the trust building among public officials and between public officials and others involves meals and drinking alcohol, especially in Shandong province, where there's it's the highest per capita alcohol consumption in China, and it's kind of viewed as part of the good life or way of building trust. So much of that came to an end because of these very strict anti-corruption measures, and it makes people a bit more atomized and individualistic than they would otherwise be. Yeah. I mean, I think it's changing a bit. There's kind of less fear of punishment. And even now, for example, the rules for now when you go out, you don't have to write down every dish. And I think beer is allowed on public expense, and people aren't so fearful and worried about taking the wrong steps as they used to be. So it's loosening up a bit, but I think there's still a long way to go. And ultimately, there has to be less reliance on fear of punishment as a way of controlling corruption, and more on other mechanisms, including, like, obviously Singapore giving higher salaries, but China is still a relatively poor country, so you can have Singapore-style salaries. But a certain amount of moral self-regulation is important, and this is where the Confucian tradition has a lot to add.
as you spoke about legalism, actually, I recall in your book, you kind of talk about your run-in with the law. And that was actually a very interesting anecdote about how the government kind of implemented very harsh measures. In fact, what you say, legalism. And then as time went by, it started to use the softer means of maybe say Confucianism, where you were kind of pushed to self-regulate through moral means.
I think that's right. And I don't think it should be unfamiliar to Singapore, where, it was known as all this stuff as the fine city. But now there's less reliance on fines. People have internalized, for example, you shouldn't jaywalk and don't throw out garbage and so on, don't litter. So it's similar in China where, so I'm not against legalism per se. I mean, sometimes you do. And remember, legalism means it's harsh punishment that's applied rigorously and uniformly and equally, without exceptions and without taking into consideration of special circumstances. And that might be necessary if there's a serious problem and we want quick results. And it could ultimately be effective in terms of making people change their minds and realize, so in the case of drinking and driving, for example, people knew that it's kind of a bad thing to do, but it didn't affect their behavior that much. So what happened in China about, more than 10 years ago, the statistics were showing there were so many accidents caused by drunk driving, and finally the government decided to take it very seriously. And in Beijing, for example, they just, on many street corners, they did random checks of people, and if they were slightly above the limit, the cars would be at least temporarily confiscated, and you wouldn't be allowed to drive for 6 months. So at the very, very start of this campaign, this happened to me as well. And it like, just in my case, it worked. After that, I'd never had a single drop if I was driving alcohol. So, and then eventually, no need to have so many checks. And it changed people's view that, even though that would deep down they knew it was a bad thing to drink and drive, but eventually these harsh measures were effective and there was no need to enforce them anymore to the same extent. And it changed from like more legal regulation to moral self-regulation. And it was quite effective. So legalism works, so to speak, if people already know that something is bad, but it doesn't really affect their behavior. And if it's a very short-term, temporary way of dealing with an emergency. And it got worse, in the sense of more legalistic, shortly after the start of the campaign. If I had been caught the same way a few months later, I would have been sent to jail and no excuses, So it became even. But then, now you drive in Beijing, and there's very, very few alcohol checks. You still have them occasionally, but hardly any. And yet there's hardly any drunk driving anymore. And of course, there's other ways of dealing with it too. There's a practice now where if you do drink alcohol and you're driving, there's a service where you phone and then a person comes on a bicycle, and which is you can fold, put it in the trunk of the car, and they would drive the car for you. So that was a very effective way also of dealing with this problem. So on the one hand, you have it changes from legal regulation to moral self-regulation. On the other hand, you have also practical ways of dealing with it.
It seems to us that the harsh laws actually more or less kind of serve as the precursor to the moral culture that you want to set in the country.
But again, it's not like the harsh laws wouldn't work if people don't know deep down that there's something wrong with that, that's right. So the real precursor is some sort of moral belief that what you're doing is wrong, but it just doesn't affect behavior. If the laws come into place and have a hammer over your head, then it would work. So so just the real precursor is some sort of view of you're doing something wrong, but it's not that wrong, and then that's where the legalist means can come in. Yeah,
it's like spitting in Singapore. We all know you shouldn't do it, right? But then people used to spit a lot on the streets, but now it's pretty much no one really does it, and no one really gets fined for it as much nowadays.
Exactly, or littering, yeah, or flushing toilets or whatever.
So far, we've talked a lot about legalism, but we also see that Confucianism actually informs a lot of Chinese political philosophy. This is where I'm making a big ask, where I'm asking you to help me sum up the rich 1,000 years of histories of Confucianism. But perhaps could you illuminate how does Confucianism today inform Chinese politics?
So, as you say, Confucianism is a very rich and diverse tradition, and if we want to narrow it down to core kind of claims, I think one thing that if you're a Confucian, you basically you have the view that the good life involves nourishing, humane, and harmonious social relations. And it sounds kind of trivial. Who disagrees with that? Well, but you do have other views of the good life, right? It could be a religious life where you're separating yourself from the community or from the family. But for the Confucians, no. I mean, it's really nourishing, humane social relations. But the best possible life is one where you serve the community as a public official, because that's the way that you can do the most good is once you have political power. And again, it sounds, well, who disagrees with that? Well, lots of people disagree with it. I mean, again, some religious ideals saying the best life involves separation from the community, or for example, in Plato's Republic, the best life involves seeking truth, and it's only the second choice that you would go back in the cave and serve the community. The community. So the Confucians say, no, the best life is serving the community, and to do that, ideally you're committed to constant self-improvement, and there's a mechanism that allows for public officials to be selected and promoted according to their superior ability and virtue. So that ideal has huge influence in the Chinese political system throughout history, but most famously, it was institutionalized also by means of the Keju, the imperial examinator or civil examination system. But more recently, this ideal has been revived in the period of economic reform in China, where public officials are selected according to their ability. And how do you measure that? Well, through experience and success at lower levels of government, however you measure that, and then through virtue, meaning don't be corrupt and you show some willingness to serve the community. So this tradition of political meritocracy has been very strongly revived over the past few decades. So people say, oh, in China there's lots of economic reform, but no political reform. Well, no political reform, what does that mean? The political system is completely different from what it was, for example, in the Cultural Revolution. Now there's a very strong, institutionalized and complex bureaucratic system which aims to select and promote public officials with superior ability and virtue. Again, highly imperfect and in constant flux, but it's there. And the ideal that motivates it is this very old Confucian ideal of political meritocracy. But again, it's not distinctly Confucian either. I mean, the Mohists arguably had a similar view, even the legalists, but the legalists cared only about ability, not about virtue, right? I mean, the legalists, like, for example, Shangyang, before, who had great influence on the ruler who became the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, he said, well, how you want to appoint the meritocratically? How do you do that? Well, by the numbers of severed heads of enemy soldiers. It's a very objective way of measuring success. They're skeptical about virtue. I think it's all hypocrisy. Maybe that's where the legalists and Taoists had something in common. But no, the Confucians say, no, we need both ability and virtue. And ability shouldn't just be military success. It should also be serving the community in an effective way, in a way that promotes people's well-being. So that's one way. And also, very concrete ways in which Confucian values affect the political system. Think of in Qufu, which is the home ground of Confucian culture in Shandong province, public officials are promoted according to how filial they are, which again also has a long tradition in Chinese history. How do you measure that? Well, they would literally interview the parents of the public officials who are being considered for promotion. If the elderly father or mother says, my son's or my daughter's not very filial, it would affect their chances of promotion in a negative way. Now that's, I'm from Canada. That would be crazy in Canada to think about. Again, in a country where there's this assumption that filial piety is important, and also it's a way of, if people cannot be kind and or have a sense of reverence for and care for their own parents, it's very hard for it to extend that love and care outside the family. So it's also a way of assessing the virtue of public officials, which is directly Confucian. But also, now to be public official, again, you have to go through all these hoops. And the first hoop is to get into a good university and to perform well academically. How do you do that? Well, you go through the Gaokao, the university examination system. And what is the content of the university examination system? Well, it has some learning of the Confucian classics. Students have to learn from some Confucius or Kongzi, have to learn some Mencius, Mengzi, and they have to learn some Xunzi. And they have to not just memorize it, but also have a sense of how to interpret those passages. So it's a very concrete ways in which the Confucian tradition has a lasting influence in the political system today. Sometimes it comes from the bottom of, not from the government itself. So there's the grave sweeping festival, Qingmingjie, which is a national holiday now. How did that come about? Well, it wasn't the government that decided it would be a national holiday. It was literally tens of millions of people, workers would take the day off to go sweep the graves and pay respect to their ancestors on that particular day. And then finally the government just said, well, Swanla, we're just going to make it into a national holiday. So some of these forces come from the bottom up as well.
Lee Kuan Yew gave this public lecture when he was talking about the Shi No Go Shang, where the scholar is seen to be the highest vocation that one can strive to. That would be the ideal life. So I suppose in China's political life, that would be quite similar, where the best or most virtuous people should strive to become politicians. So there seems to be a contrast with, say, in America, where the country as a whole, its culture emulates or seeks to emulate the capitalists, where talent overwhelmingly concentrates itself in the capitalist sector. What do you think of that view?
I think that's right. But remember, China is a very diverse country. So the Confucian influence is stronger in Shandong province and related parts of China. If you go in the south, there's much more entrepreneurial, and it's much closer to this ideal that the way to achieve success is by making money. And again, this is very concrete ways. So the lucky number in most of China, especially the south, is the number 8, right? Because it sounds like ba and fa, it sounds like making money. On license plates and phones, you would want to see lucky number 8. I think it's similar in Singapore, right? If I'm not mistaken. But in Shandong province, the lucky number is 7. Why? Because there's this saying, qi shang ba xia. So if you are 57 years old and you're in the government, you still have a hope of being promoted. But if you're 58, you're basically on the way down. So in my university, to have an office with a number 7 would be more prestigious than one with number 8. License plates in Shandong province, you have people fight to have the number 7, also in phone numbers. So again, China is very diverse, and this kind of ideal that the best life is the life of the scholar, especially the scholar official, is stronger in the parts of China that are more influenced by the Confucian tradition.
Then it brings me to my next question: the influence of Marxism in Chinese politics today. I think most Western commentators or the Western media has a very crude view. So they kind of see the communists and they equate communism with suppression, with the lack of political rights, and they see it as a complete state control. What would be the more nuanced take here?
So it depends. I mean, the communist tradition also is very diverse. So it's like the Confucian tradition, although arguably, not arguably, quite new and less diverse. But so you have Marx's own original vision of communism, which was that the problem with capitalism is that capital obviously is owned by capitalists, and the massive workers have to work to make money. So work is a means to life rather than life's prime want. And we should move towards a society where the workers are not forced to work as a means to life. How do you do that? Well, ultimately by developing the economy so that there's advanced machinery which does the socially necessary work, and then the people's basic needs are met, and then they're free to realize their creative talents. How do you do that? Well, you have to go through capitalist process. This is Marx's own view, Marx's own theory of history, because only through capitalism can you develop the technology and the ability to use that technology in an effective way, because capitalists need to compete with each other to make profit. And the way to do that is by having improving technology. So as a byproduct of this capitalism, you have increased technology, better machinery, And eventually we reach a point where, according to Marx, capitalism can be overthrown. We can move towards a communist system where the technology is basically owned by the people, and people are the socially necessary work is done by the machines, and then people are free to realize their creative talents. So that's the idea. And now in China, Marxism is making a bit of a comeback because there's this pretty optimistic view about AI that will allow us, not now, but decades from now, if it's managed in a way that's socially beneficial or regulated in a way that's socially beneficial, maybe we could, several decades from now, have the possibility where advanced machinery does a socially necessary work, the dirty, dangerous, repetitive work that people wouldn't want to do if they didn't have to, and then we're all free to realize our creative talents. So this is one reason why Marxism is being revived in China now as well, because this Marxist ideal of communism seems to be more of a possibility now. Deng Xiaoping had it right. We need to go through capitalism to develop productive forces, but that's only a means. Eventually, we need to move on towards a more communist society. So that's one reason why communism is making a comeback as well. Now, again, it's not the same as the Confucian ideal. The Confucian ideal, to repeat, is it's through harmonious and humane social relations. That's how we realize our creative essence, which needn't involve creative work. But for the Marxists, it's really through creative work that we realize our creative essences. So how do we reconcile those two? I mean, in practice, they might conflict, right? I mean, when I present some of these ideas in mainland China, once I had a young woman came up to me and says, it's not so abstract. I feel this tension. I mean, on the one hand, I want to realize myself through work. On the other hand, I owe obligations to my elderly parents, and they come into conflict and time-wise and energy-wise. And how do I manage that? So there's no necessarily harmonious way of dealing with this issue. But I think both ideals are important. And if we want to understand the Chinese political system and the kind of ideals and motive, I think we need to understand both of those. Now, another kind of more historical point about Marxism is that why did it really become the dominant ideology in China? And one reason is that for Marx, again, and I think this is pretty much all Marxists would agree upon this, the ultimate aim of government, or at least the most important obligation, was to provide for the material well-being of people. And that ideal goes way back. I mean, the Confucians had this view a long, long time ago. Even Mencius, who's known to be the most ideal of the Confucians, he said, well, first people have to have a stable kind of, sometimes hung is translated as property or basic material needs, and then they can be moral. Because how can you be moral if you're always struggling for necessities? I mean, that's a classic Marxist point as well. First, you provide the basic material needs of people, and then they can exercise their morality, they can care about other people's well-being and have obligations to society beyond the family and so on. So there's this very kind of, and throughout Chinese history, the governments have had a strong view of we need to deal with famine, we need to deal with poverty, way before Western governments had even considered this view that one obligation of dealing with government is to alleviate poverty. That's a relatively new idea in the West, like 300 or 400 years old. But in China, it goes way back to the early Confucians. That's one reason why Marxism also, I think, took hold in the 20th century in China. Now, of course, the dark side, too, is that, the Leninist view of the Marxist tradition, I mean, on the one hand, it's that you need a strong central organization to rule the country. On the other hand, we can rely on extreme measures to purge political opponents. That view also had strong influence, especially in wartime, right? I mean, one of the reasons why, frankly, why the communists won, let's say first in the Civil War to Kuomintang, is that they had a much stronger Leninist organization, more effective, where what the leader said was transmitted to the bottom, and it worked. And sometimes it was pretty harsh measures of dealing with opponents. And in a wartime, that might be an effective strategy. But once you start ruling a country in times of peace, then that kind of approach can often lead to disasters, as happened in subsequent 19...
The follow-on question that I had actually with regards to Marxism was that, there's this view that the state will fade away, that once you've extracted everything you can, once your machinery is so advanced, the state will fade away. But in China, you argue that that's not going to be the case, that the state is going to continue playing a very strong hand, even in the ideal version of itself. Why?
So Marx didn't anticipate several developments that now are obvious to us. One is that he was very optimistic about machinery and technology, and he thought machinery could eventually reach a point where it would do the socially necessary work. But he didn't anticipate the possibility that machinery could become so advanced that it could dominate human beings, and even to the point of posing an existential threat to human beings. And now with the development of AI, I mean, it is something that we worry about. So there's a very strong need for a state to regulate AI so to ensure that AI serves human needs and to prevent the possibility, or at least to minimize the risk, that AI develops to the point where it can pose an existential threat to human, where it makes us slaves as opposed to technology being the slaves, or let's just slaves is an extreme term. I mean, ideally, machinery would serve human beings rather than the other way around, and there's a need for a state to ensure that possibility. That's one thing. Also, issues like climate change. Again, Marx couldn't anticipate, or at least he didn't anticipate, that technology would reach a point where it develops to such a point that it could destroy the environment and create an atmosphere whereby an environment would again pose an existential threat to human beings in the form of, for example, climate change and global warming. So to regulate that too, we need a strong state. Obviously, atomic, nuclear weapons. I mean, that is an existential threat, and we need a state to regulate nuclear weapons. Today, of course, we think of pandemics too. We need a state to deal with that. So for all those reasons, there are these existential threats out there that Marx couldn't anticipate. And Marx thought, once we have advanced machinery and people's basic needs are being taken care of, we don't need a state, because the main point of the state is to exercise coercion, especially in the benefit of the ruling class. But if there's no ruling class, then there's no need for a coercive state anymore. It'll wither away. Well, now we know, even if there's advanced machinery and social and material equality between people, but there's still going to be a need for a state, at least with the ability to prevent existential threats from becoming serious.
The state is really there to kind of provide the guardrails to ensure that the means of production isn't actually turned against you, I suppose.
Sure. Yes, that's part of it. But I mean, also not just to provide the guardrails, but to try to ensure, I mean, until we reach the state where there is this kind of higher communist society where people's basic material needs are met because of advanced machinery, but to try to steer technological development in a way that is beneficial to human beings, meaning that the technology serves the people as opposed to the way around. Until we reach this state of higher communism, there's going to be a need for a more active state to try to ensure that the technology serves the people rather than the other way around.
Fast forward to today, when we look at someone like President Xi and his policies, we see two keystone policies, the 双列循环, which is the dual circulation track, where he's trying to strengthen the domestic economy of China by strengthening its consumption, by strengthening its domestic consumption. And at the same time, you also have the 共同富裕, the common prosperity drive that he's been implementing in his policies. From the outside, it seems that, this seems to be a much more Marxist government, in a sense that it is trying to redistribute wealth to the working class much more aggressively. But how much of it can we attribute to President Xi himself, and how much of it do we actually attribute to the larger policy organ, which is the CPC?
I think there's a tendency to think that it's just one person who decides everything in the Chinese political system. I mean, in 2012, there were three major issues or challenges for China. One is that corruption was completely out of hand, and it was really posing a threat to the political system. It was to get into schools or hospitals, to get access to public services, you had to pay bribes. It was really infuriating the people. That's one issue. Two, the economic development was so rapid that it led to a huge gap between rich and poor, and again, which led to a lot of resentment against the rich, and some feeling that the system was being unequal in terms of people didn't have any more equal opportunities to compete and to flourish in the way that there was before. And three, there was a huge economic development had this environmentally catastrophic consequences. I mean, it was, in Beijing, where I lived at the time, and it was really terrible. The pollution was completely out of control, and it affected people's everyday lives. And that was common through much of China, terrible water quality and so on. So these were the three problems that had to be dealt with. It didn't matter who was the number one. These issues would have been dealt with. And that's more or less what happened since 2012. There's been much more emphasis on reducing corruption, much more emphasis on reducing income gaps and gaps between rich and poor, and promoting more equal opportunity for people from impoverished and disadvantaged areas, and much stronger measures to deal with environmental sustainability. So the current leader is, of course, he's the first among equals. And the Politburo, the Standing Committee, was changed in a way, because before 2012, there were 9 leaders in the Standing Committee, and each one basically controlled part of the system and had veto power over anything that affected, their interests. So it was very hard to get things done because there were many, veto powers in the political system. So eventually it's moved towards a system where there were 7 people in the Standing Committee with a first among equals, and it was easier to tackle vested interests that blocked necessary change in terms of reducing of corruption, dealing with the environment, and reducing income or gaps between rich and poor. And so again, I mean, it's hard. All that probably would have happened regardless of who was the number one, So yes, I mean, we can say that President Xi, or General Secretary Xi, however you want to describe him, is committed to Marxist ideals, and that helps as part of the explanation for why we have had changes. But I wouldn't put too much, weight upon the personal preferences of one leader in the political system.
But I would say that they made tremendous progress in tackling the 3 issues they pointed out. Even for myself, when I went there in the past year, you could tell that, for example, the widespread electrification of all its vehicles, the quality of air in all your major urban cities have pretty much improved significantly just within the past 10 years. And I think that's something that if you ask someone in 2012 whether that would happen, they probably couldn't imagine that.
That's right.
The offshoot of that question would be then, when you look at the politics of China, to many outsiders, Western media, for example, it's very opaque. China, in a sense that it has not been able to translate itself to be sufficiently intelligible to our outside public because they've been so focused on communicating inwards, maybe to their own country. What are some examples in which China hasn't translated itself well to the outside world?
It's related partly to the political system and even to the anti-corruption campaign. Again, the downside of the anti-corruption campaign is that it makes public officials more conservative and risk-averse. So to communicate in a way that's persuasive to people outside of China, if all you do is say what's great about China and you don't recognize that there are problems, and then it sounds like empty propaganda, and that's not going to be persuasive to people. But if you, so that's why there's a need for a form of communication that shows that China, of course, has lots of good things about it, but also some bad things, and let's portray China in a more realistic way, in a more humane way that engages with people. But because of this conservatism in the political system, not anytime, but often when journalists or even academics want to portray a system or want to portray a picture of China that is a bit more balanced and realistic, well, then they often run into problems. I mean, censorship, or in the case of journalists, they get they run into trouble with the authorities. So this is part of the source of the issue. But in private, people recognize that. I mean, including in the government. But it's it's not just at the higher levels, but at the mid-tier levels, public officials are often very risk-averse and conservative. So just even my own book, right? Okay. So part of what I try to show in my recent book, The Dean of Shandong, I try to show that how much of China, how much even among public officials and bureaucrats, there's a lot of humanity and humor and And I try to portray that in a relatively balanced way. And I did get some permission to do that and to communicate in the book by certain officials. But because it also portrays things in a way that's not wholly positive, it has yet to be accepted as a publication in mainland China. It has in Hong Kong, again, which shows that Hong Kong has more academic freedom than mainland China. But I mean, if even my book, and you can probably tell, I'm like, as positive as you can be among, people who are not, strictly in the system or born and bred in China. If even my stuff runs into trouble, I mean, you can imagine others. That said, I mean, there are indications that things are improving a bit. I mean, even very recently, you probably know this phenomenon of TikTok refugees. It's only happened in the past few weeks. People have fled TikTok and gone to Xiaohongshu, which is the Chinese app. And so many foreigners, and now because we have easy ways of translating online, so there's more communication of the humanity and humor of China, including things that are not going as well as they should, which portrays China in a more balanced and humane way, which actually I think does much more to promote China's soft power than what officials do when they try to show the good side of China without confronting the problems.
There's another aspect of it, which is also the idea of having the Mingzheng Yanshun, right, where they actually have proper naming conventions. I think you've pointed that out, that they often don't try to promote a softer image of itself, even overseas, or they maybe are not too familiar with the linguistic differences.
One clear example of that is in the 2008 opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, there was one character that was chosen to represent Chinese culture, and it's the character he, which is usually translated as harmony. And I remember when I was watching it on, I think it was NBC in English, and the commentators were saying, "Wow, look at this! This is Chinese harmony." And they were pointing to the soldiers who were all marching up and down in unison. They said, "This is pretty scary to have everybody thinking and acting in the same way." But anybody who knows anything about Chinese and about Confucius, I mean, every intellectual knows this saying from the Analects of Confucius, right? 和而不同, 君子和而不同, which means that you should seek 和, which we can translate as diversity and harmony, rather than 同, which we can translate as sameness or uniformity or conformity. So the Chinese idea of harmony is that it includes, in fact, it's a love of diversity. And the metaphors that are used to express this show this very clearly. For example, a soup that has only one ingredient like salt will not taste well. You have to have many ingredients. Music that has only one note, it's going to be boring. To make it beautiful, we have to have many notes. And even in politics, this idea of he was used in a way very explicitly, saying that if you're a ruler and you only listen to one political view, that's a recipe for disaster, because you'll never find out what goes wrong and be able to correct it. You have to have diverse views among political rulers. And this was used as a way of showing the idea of harmony. So just because of this mistranslation that in English, when you think of harmony, especially in a political setting, it triggers off all these alarm bells. It sounds like conformity or uniformity or sameness, which is exactly the opposite of this Chinese idea of harmony. So just at the very bottom, this is the easiest thing to do, is to get the translations right, is a way of preventing misunderstanding. So again, the central idea of in Chinese culture, he, I think we should translate as something like diversity and harmony to prevent misunderstandings.
Over the years, the government has changed its name for different ministries time and time again to refresh itself, right? So I think, for example, we have this Xuan Chuanbu equivalent in Singapore, which would have previously been the Ministry of Communication and Information, as now the Ministry of Digital Development and Information, because now you have a much more digital dimension in the way you transmit information.
Some of the labels for the translations of the government ministries are just, Xuan Chuanbu, as you know, was originally translated as propaganda, and now I think it's publicity. But even publicity sounds a bit pejorative. I mean, if it's something like communication, it would be a bit more neutral. Or Tongjianbu, United Front. I mean, in wartime, United Front, that refers to united, that when this was in wartime, right? the communists and the Kuomintang would be united to confront the Japanese. Now this wartime terminology is not appropriate. I mean, we need to think of a different, well, I think should be changed also in Chinese, to reflect a new reality. That's not what we're talking about. But it sounds so sinister, on the outside when you think of this United Front Department, which is not really the bulk of what they do. Even the party secretary, again, I mentioned that in the book, especially at lower levels of government, they don't spend most of their time on, making people follow the party line. Most of the time, especially in the universities, they spend their time smoothing out human relations and doing the kind of non-academic work, which is important. So this goes back to your earlier question. In Western universities, you don't have party secretaries, which of course is good in a way because it means there's less censorship. But on the other hand, if there's a party secretary who's in charge of, so let's just call it social problems at the university. For example, where I was at Shandong University, we had a very serious incident involving a car accident, and then the party secretary had to comfort the parents. I mean, that sort of thing is a good thing, and if you have that, we can call them, harmony secretaries. If we have that sort of function, it wouldn't necessarily a bad thing. Of course, stripped of the political censorship role, ideally, it might be something to learn from. And it's not just my own imagination. At the first time in Chinese history, this huge increase of psychotherapy. Who are the therapists often now? Initially, they were party secretaries because they were used to dealing with human conflict and trying to harmonize relations in a good way. And then they had the same sorts of skills which allow them to be effective therapists. It's quite fascinating, all this stuff.
You wrote an interesting essay about how China will look like in 50 years' time or in 2050. And in it, you paint a vision where meritocracy and democracy could complement each other, where people could participate in politics on a much more wider scale, but at the same time, you could still get competent public officials. Now, what would that look like for a meritocratic and more democratic China in the future?
Well, it's hard to know. So as you know, that essay was quite speculative and it involved a certain amount of humor. What would it involve? Well, so the ruling organization now is about 100 million people. Maybe in 20 or 30 years' time, it'll be 120 million people. So that's a huge organization, which also has a lot of internal diversity. So there's room for having much more democracy within the ruling organization. How that would come about, and how that could be institutionalized in a way that doesn't lead to open conflict and factions is a very important issue, but it can't be constantly suppressed. So I'm almost certain one of the things that, and again, you get this when you talk to people off the record. In China, once you have a certain amount of trust with people, you get very open conversation. And I think there's a very strong recognition of the need for a much more democracy within the ruling organization, so that all party members have some sort of say in the political system in a way that is less kind of top-down now. That could take different forms. There could be some sort of sortition whereby people are selected at random within the ruling organization, because it's already a very good quality check, and then could have some sort of say in policy making. There might be more electoral mechanisms within the ruling organization, more mechanisms for deliberation. That's one thing. What about outside the ruling organization? Well, it's also important to have some sort of long-lasting legitimacy for the whole political system to have some sort of stamp of legitimacy by those who are outside the ruling organization as well. What could that be? Well, it could take different forms. It could be implicit. It could be some form of AI that we don't know yet that would allow for some consultation and among the people at large. It could be a referendum that would say, look, you give us as a party 30 years of ruling time, long term enough to make decisions that affect future generations, and that allows us to train and recruit people for the long term, and that we could deal with issues like climate change without worrying about being elected every 4 or 5 years. But yet at some point, 30 years later, there's some sort of check on the political system. Also, some and having much more freedom of speech in society at large. I mean, one thing, if you talk to intellectuals in China, like anybody, I'm going to make a sweeping statement here, but it's like, I'm going to say largely true. Almost anybody under like 50 years old favors more freedom of speech in China. It's almost the only thing that unites liberals and socialists and Confucians and others is strong commitment to freedom of speech. So so among those who are outside the political system, there's more freedom of speech, more ways of organizing and politically and making their voices known, while recognizing that ultimately it's the ruling organization that makes the final decision, especially on big issues. I mean, that's one way of having stronger democratic mechanisms combined with meritocratic political system.
What's your critique of cuteness?
It's really odd on the face of it, but East Asian cultures that have this Confucian heritage, one thing they have in common is this culture of cuteness, where you have a lot of cute animals in social media, emojis. Of course, you have that to a certain extent outside, but not nearly to the same extent. I mean, even as a bureaucrat in the political system like myself, when I communicated with other bureaucrats, I would always use emojis and happy faces as a way of communicating my emotions. And when I shared this with a professor who was at a leading university in the US, I showed him a little bit in my social media scrolls, just very quickly. I said, "Do you have this at university?" He just laughed, says, No, definitely not. So there is this code. So the good side of this culture of cuteness is that it's a way of communicating your emotions and softening the otherwise hard-edged kind of communication. I mean, the downside of meritocracy, and you know this very much in Singapore as well, is that it leads to a kind of hyper-competitive society where people are often very ambitious and afraid of losing. 就怕输, afraid of losing.
怕输.
Kesu, right, exactly. So that's the downside of this meritocracy, right? You always want to be ahead of people, being ambitious and number one. But this culture of cuteness is always a kind of rebelling against it. It's like, no, we don't care. We just want to enjoy ourselves. And it's a kind of, we can use the language of Taoism, a kind of carefree way of life, which is a very counterpoint, almost rebelling against this hyper-competitive, ambitious side. And no, not coincidentally, it started in Japan. It's these cute she's like teenage girls who developed this culture of cuteness. It spread rapidly to other countries with a Confucian heritage and this super meritocratic kind of ways, which you have in the educational system, the political system, to a certain extent, in the economy as well. The downside of that is that if you have people who are public officials who use this cuteness as a way of evading responsibility or making jokes when you should be making hard decisions, that can be a recipe for disaster. And I use an example from outside East Asia. Boris Johnson, I mean, to my mind, he was very charming. Some people don't get this. I get it. I mean, if I had to go out, on a dinner with a politician, I would love to go out with Boris Johnson. Very charming, very humorous, and cute, But when it comes to making decisions, he was horrible. I mean, he would evade responsibility and lie. And I saw that flaw in myself when I served as dean. Sometimes I tended to, make jokes and try to be cute as a way of evading responsibility and hard decisions. So that's the downside of this culture of cuteness. And there was a bit of self-criticism in this as well.
In Singapore, if you observe the political landscape, I think we see a similar thing where politicians are using social media more, not as a way to kind of communicate policy stances or difficult things they have to do, but more as a way to endear themselves, right? So you see kind of them following on dance trends and going on their official trips. They will go and show you around like where they're going. And even in the most recent American elections, I think we see that as well, where a lot of the election kind of marketing has been run on the aspect of the personality more than the policy. So the personality, in a sense, outshines the policy, and that perhaps is a right critique of cuteness.
But on the other hand, it's not, if you want to endear yourself or show that you're human side as a public official, that's okay, right? So long as it doesn't take too much time away from what you should be doing, which is thinking of policies that benefit the people. And so long as it's not a way of evading responsibility and taking hard decisions, then I don't see anything wrong with that.
You have to find the golden mean. You have to be appropriately cute, I guess.
Right. Go King Sui had that. He was so charming and cute, and maybe in private. Besides being brilliant and creative, I wish once or twice I went out for meals with him. I wish that I had taken notes, and so that I could tell the stories. But I just remember being so charmed by him.
That's what people remember of him as well, privately. But when he was out in public, he was much more serious.
So probably he had the golden mean, because you take hard decisions, and he certainly didn't use his cuteness to get in the way of that.
You're a Canadian yourself. You're also in China. So I wanted to ask you, what's the best part about China and Canada you wish more people know about?
Let me start with Canada. I mean, so for Canada, I think there's two parts that I think are lovely. One is Montreal, where I'm from. It's a city which is such a cool and creative city that's also safe. So it really combines the best of this order and harmony, both in the sense of order and love of diversity. And it's super creative, and it's bilingual. I mean, it's Singapore, most people speak two languages. In Montreal, almost everybody is perfectly bilingual, French and English. And bilingualism is means you can imagine yourself through other people's perspective in a much easier way. So there's a lot of evidence that bilingualism actually is an important way to have more empathy and compassion for other people. So you have that in Montreal. The downside of Montreal is that it's very, very cold in the winter. So I haven't been back in the winter in many years. But other than that, it's a wonderful place. And it's not as well known in East Asia because people tend to go to Toronto and Vancouver. I would strongly, of course I'm biased, I'm from there, but I think that's like the best part of Canada, to be frank. The other part, of course, is that I'm what we call ice hockey. I mean, in Canada, we just call it hockey fan. And again, hockey is such a beautiful sport, and it's hardly well known. In Singapore, I don't know if there was a league. It's a sport that really combines grace and beauty with power, and it's beautiful to watch. And that's really I think the best part of Canada as well. If you like sports, and which I do, and I like all sports, but again, maybe because I'm from Montreal and so on, but hockey is, to my mind, the sport that combines this kind of gracefulness, this with power, and it's absolutely beautiful to watch. And there's strong emphasis on passing and deferring to other people. And even when you interview hockey players, they're always kind of almost Confucian, putting themselves down and saying, "I'm doing all this for the team." And at the moment, the Montreal Canadiens hockey team is perhaps the most exciting young team in hockey. Those are the two best parts of Canada at the moment, if I can say that. So about China, well, China's a diversity. I mean, it's a continent, not a country, and even it's not just the difference between the city and the rural areas, which are completely different worlds, but different cities also have different ethoses and spirits. And the people in Shanghai and Beijing are really very different, and often they dislike each other, and it's very interesting to articulate that. I wrote a book called The Spirit of Cities, and where I tried along with my co-author called Avner, de-Shalit from Jerusalem, to where we tried to articulate some of this. And then a subsequent follow-up book in Chinese about the spirit of cities, mainly in Chinese cities. Again, to understand China, you have to. It's this diversity within China, which is not well known outside. I mean, even in Shandong province, the difference between Jinan and Qingdao are huge. And it's quite fascinating to explore the diversity of China, which is not as well known outside of China. That's one part of China, as well as just the humanity and humor of everyday life, which is really, people think of the political system and it's true. I mean, the politicians are so deadly boring and stern often, but it's at everyday life, and as well as mid-levels of the bureaucracy, as I tried to show in this latest book, there's so much humanity and humor. I think it's very important to communicate that as well to the rest of the world.
If there was a spirit of Hong Kong today, what would the spirit of Hong Kong look like?
So Hong Kong is quite fascinating because it's committed to capitalism, and it's in the basic law, right? I mean, it's in a communist country, but so there's this celebration of making money, and which can often take very ugly forms. And in Hong Kong, there is a huge gap between rich and poor, and the public housing half the people live in public housing is terrible compared to the public housing in Singapore. So the downside of capitalism is very, very clear. But on the other hand, you have this kind of social order. And, there's this saying, that if you like drive a Rolls Royce in the poorest parts of the US, you would get rocks thrown your window. But if you go to the poorest parts of Hong Kong in a kind of gold Rolls Royce, people would come and admire it. There's kind of odd, I mean, there's this respect for wealth, which is quite powerful in Hong Kong. But I think it's moderated at the end of the day by this kind of Confucian ethos. I mean, Hong Kong didn't go through the revolution, so of course in the revolution there was this attempt to destroy Confucianism, which was not successful, fortunately. But in Hong Kong, there wasn't that. So the everyday family life is very much informed by Confucian ethics. And his commitment to serve the family and serve the community and expand this kind of love and care within the family to outsiders. You have that in Hong Kong to a strong extent. So this moderates the excesses of capitalism. So if I were to try to articulate the ethos of Hong Kong, which I did actually, there's a chapter in that book, it would be somewhere along those lines.
What advice do you usually give to your graduates as they enter the workforce?
So my students are very diverse, and one of the so Confucius Kongzi, he was a teacher of teachers, and he had a wonderful model of teaching, whereby sometimes he would give contradictory advice to different students depending upon what their needs and interests are, so there's no general advice. I mean, I'd have to know who the student is in all his or her glorious individuality, and only then, would I be able to engage with the student, again, following Kongzi's model. But if there's one general point, which is, I mean, the future is absolutely uncertain, but the only thing for certain, if we're lucky to get through it without, war that destroys all of humanity, is that it's going to be a very rapid change, both technological and social. So when I was in university, we would think, well, what kind of job do we want? There's this kind of assumption, once you find a job, that's it pretty much until you retire. But now, I mean, again, this in Singapore, I think Singapore is doing probably better than any other place in the world at preparing students for a world of constant change, and there's a need for constant learning and be ready to do completely different things throughout the course of your life.
Actually, in that light, you taught 2 lessons. You actually taught me the right frame to read the 论语, to read the Analects, which is not to kind of take a general view and try to appreciate the individual context of each.
This is Kongzi and his students, and each student is different. And you basically think of it like a play, and you have to have a bit of background knowledge. And he deliberately, when he teaches the students, he only says part of what he thinks is correct, and then he hopes that students will develop the rest on their own. So it's important to have that sort of background knowledge of who the students are, what their interests are, what they're famous for, in subsequent Chinese history, and why Kongzi is saying this to each student, and then what part should be filled in through constant interpretations and reinterpretations. That's why the Gaokao is it sends the wrong message, because students have to memorize parts of classic texts, including the Analects, the 论语, and they have to memorize the correct interpretation. For, Kongzi would be shocked. No, there's no one correct interpretation. Some are better than others, but the interpretations change over time based upon new knowledge and new challenges and so on, as well as who's doing the interpreting and what context they're in. So it's very important to have knowledge of that to try to make sense and to enjoy the text.
With that, probably can we find your work?
This is the latest book called The Dean of Shandong, Confessions of a Minor Bureaucrat at a Chinese university. And it's written in a way that tries to show the humanity and humor, as well as trying to draw some implications from some of my experiences serving as dean. So this is another one called The China Model, which is much more academic, and which tries to show it tries to discuss in a systematic way what political meritocracy is, what are its advantages and disadvantages, and how to reduce the gap between ideal and reality in the Chinese setting. And then this is another book, recent one, called Just Hierarchy, co-written with Wang Pei, who's my colleague and also wife actually, at University of Hong Kong. And so we try to show that any modern society needs hierarchies. We know which ones are bad based on race or sex or class, but which ones are good and why. There's a need to theorize about that and to show lots of examples. That's what we try to do in that book. So these books are available in the usual places, Amazon and so on.
Thank you, Prof, for coming on.
Oh, thank you for this engagement, and I look forward to your own. I love your podcast, and I watched the whole one with about Dr. Go King Sui, which was wonderful. And I look forward to more of your podcasts and to learning more. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the episode with Professor Daniel Bell. If you're watching this on YouTube, we would greatly appreciate if you could hit that subscribe button down below. If you are listening to this podcast on another platform, we would greatly appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening to the Pharaoh Podcast, and we hope to catch you in the next episode.